So, the next big picture topic that we're going to be dealing with here in this last chapter is going to be the focus on feminism. And here in the 20th century, this notion of feminism is going to be tied in with the possibility of liberation. And feminism is actually going to go from something that is definitely concentrated in the Western world, especially Europe and the United States, to something that's going to be a little bit more global. So, to start off the notes, the idea of liberation traveled around the world in the 20th century. I mean, this is one of the big vibes that we have going on throughout the last two chapters. The 1960s, in particular, sees a convergence of protest movements around the world, suggesting a new culture of liberation. And these are going to vary from place to place. Like, for example, in the United States, we had the civil rights movement, the youthful counterculture, and also the anti war protests, because remember, it's the Vietnam era. In Europe, there's protest against an unresponsive bureaucracy, consumerism, and middle class values, especially in France in 1968. And you want to put down here next to B, you want to put, please, here by the mid to late 1950s. By the mid to late 1950s, Europe was economically recovered and growing. Europe was economically recovered and growing. In the communist world, you also have the attempt to give socialism a human face with the Prague Spring in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. We also start to have this development, and this is a phrase that I've used in the last section, the development of the idea of the third world, which is also known as the developing world, the global south. I mean, there'd be a number of different names for this particular area. And here, there's the dream of offering an alternative to both capitalism and communism through economic renewal. Another term for this, or another phrase for this, you want to put this down here next to A, underneath number two. You want to put down that they wanted to find a quote unquote third way. They wanted to find a quote unquote third way. Something that's not necessarily Western or completely Western, and something that maybe is a little bit more them and more unique to them. Among all these liberation movements that are taking place, feminism had the most profound potential for change. Remember, there's just this vibe of liberation going on with decolonization, with places of oppressed minorities within groups. Think, Black Africans in South Africa because of apartheid. But for feminism, this movement has the most potential for profound change because it's going to be something that is easily global. With this feminism, there's a rethinking of the basic relationships between men and women. And we talked briefly about feminism a couple chapters ago, but it began in the West in the 19th century with suffrage. Although you want to put here, you want to do two things. One, you want to put a little star here by B underneath number three. And then you want to put down here, then next to B, still underneath number three, you want to put down that it actually began with property rights. It actually began with property rights. What happens, and I think that this was mentioned to you before, is that women start to demand to be able to maintain property, whether it's actual like land or money in their own names, and then they would use that right to then justify their right to vote in the same way that men had been using that to justify their extended right to vote. Now, feminism is going to be a little different based upon where it is, because women in different locations are going to have different needs, they're going to have different demands. So, this modern feminism, this organized feminism, is going to be revived in the West in the 1960s with a new agenda. We're going to be tweaking some things a little bit. One, they're going to be against the historical understanding of women as the other or as the deviant. There's also going to be the demanded right of women to control their own bodies. And this is going to be transformative by one thing. And you want to put down here next to B underneath number one, you want to put down that this gained popularity. This gained popularity with the advent of the birth control pill. This gained popularity with the advent of the birth control pill. With the pill, this is going to allow women to take control over their own bodies, to take control over their sexuality, over their sex lives, to have it be in their hands whether or not they choose to become pregnant rather than relying on their partner's use of a condom, for example. The agenda is also going to be one of equal rights in employment and also in education. And this women's liberation movement is going to be a broad attack on the patriarchy as a system of domination. And this is not going to be a new idea. In fact, you want to put down here next to number two, do you want to put, please, here that this is a throwback to the Enlightenment? This is a throwback to the Enlightenment, where feminists or women who were sort of kind of seeking some different types of rights during that Enlightenment period from 1750 to, to the 1790s, give or take a little bit, they're kind of comparing what is going on with the household, within the household, and this male dominated society to being the equivalent of the tyranny under an unjust monarchy. So they were kind of drawing on those parallels. And this is something that, again, this modern feminism is going to reference back to. Now, the issue is also going to be divided along the color lines as well, where Black women are going to emphasize their solidarity with men, with Black men, and not separation from them. Now, there's a specific reason for this, and you want to put this down here next to number three. You want to put down that this is part of the civil rights movement. This is part of the civil rights movement. Now, for women in the global south, this is going to be a little bit different. Like, for example, women had been welcomed into the communist and revolutionary movements, but were sidelined after the movement's success. The thing with this, you want to put this down here next to number one, is this occurred in all communist countries. This occurred in all communist countries. So, in some of these developing areas, especially in what had formerly been communist areas, you're going to see that women, while the revolutionary movement was going on, and this is also going to be the case in some other areas as well, when the revolutionary movements are going on, women are highly valued for for their abilities as revolutionaries, for their abilities to kind of infiltrate places or be less suspicious than maybe some of their male counterparts were and are. The problem is going to be is that once these revolutions are done, almost uniformly, women are going to be pushed off to the side. Many African feminists in the 1970s are going to think that the Western feminists are just simply too individualistic, that they're kind of focused on their own selves rather than a larger collective of women. And they're also too focused on sex. What they really do here, and you want to put down next to number two underneath capital B, you want to put down that they saw Western feminists as selfish. They saw Western feminists as selfish. What they also don't like is Western feminists intruding on certain aspects of their culture and deeming it anti women or deeming it anti feminist. In particular, some of these African feminists are going to resent women's feminist interest in cultural matters such as female circumcision and also polygamy. They just want the Western feminists to kind of stay in their own lane. Like, look, pump the brakes. This isn't something that you need to evaluate. This is something that we find culturally significant and culturally identifying, and has nothing to do with it being, anti-woman. However, not all women's movements are going to deal explicitly with gender. In Kenya, for example, women's groups movements are going to support individual women and communities. In Morocco, feminist movements are going to target laws defining women as minors, and women are actually finally going to gain legal equality in 2004. In Chile, women are going to be incredibly important in the movement during Pinochet's dictatorship. And these women are going to cross party lines. They're going to help groups survive economically and also help to expose human rights abuses. I mean, these women will stand outside in masses and make sure that they are relaying the truth about some of the horrors of Pinochet's dictatorships. Holding signs, chanting, doing a lot of things, and they are very much responsible for ultimately Pinochet being brought to The Hague, to an international tribunal, and to be tried for crimes against humanity and crimes against human benefit. Eventually, here, it's this women's question that is going to become a global issue in the 20th century, and it kind of achieves some type of international significance, where the UN declared 1975 as International Women's Year, and it also declared 75 to 85 as the decade for women. However, there are some very sharp divisions within global feminism, versus such as who has the right to speak on the behalf of women. There's conflict between developed and developing nations' interests that we just sort of kind of talked about earlier. And also within some of these developing worlds, or within these developing areas, the third world groups are going to often disagree. Guys, you want to put a big star here by this section underneath number 2. And again, also, just like we saw the last time we dealt with feminism, there is a global backlash to feminism. And you want to put stars here by both A and C, and then we'll have like little notes that will go with those as well. Some are going to argue that this agenda undermined family life and relations between men and women. You want to put down here next to A, just like in the 19th century, just like in the 19th century. Some of these arguments are really going to simply be old hat. Some are also going to take exception to the emphasis on reproductive rights. The groups that are especially going to be against this, and this is the note I want you to add here next, is C, especially religious groups, especially religious groups.